thank you all so much for joining us for our Yom Ha'atzmaut webinar. I'm so pleased that so many partner organizations have come together once again to commemorate Israel's 77th Independence Day, from the Hatikvah Slate to various groups under the Progressive Israel Network umbrella that many of us on this call support. I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge the terrible fires raging in Israel right now. Our hearts are with all of those impacted. For those who don't know me, I'm Talia Benamy, and I'm incredibly proud to be a delegate for the Hatikvah Slate. I'm also, among other things, the Communal Outreach Chair for J Street's New York City chapter and the chair of Jewish Democratic Women for Action. So suffice it to say that I spend a lot of my time thinking about the topics we're about to discuss, and I'm honored to be moderating today's discussion with our esteemed speakers. Before I introduce them, a quick overview of what you can expect on today's call. We'll be spending the bulk of our time in conversation with our speakers. I'll be asking them a number of questions, and if there's a question you would like to be asked, please use the Q&A feature. You can see it at the bottom of your Zoom screens. We will be monitoring that throughout. We'll do our best to get through as many topics and questions as possible. And near the end of the discussion, we'll be sharing a link for a separate optional Zoom call for Hatikvah Get Out the Vote efforts. So now to introduce our speakers. Rabbi Sharon Brous is the senior and founding rabbi of IKAR, a leading-edge Jewish community based in Los Angeles, and the author of The Amen Effect, Ancient Wisdom to Heal Our Hearts and Mend Our Broken World, which was a national bestseller. Rabbi Brous offered the invocation at the Democratic National Convention in 2024, led the Hanukkah candlelighting with the Vice President and Second Gentleman in 2023, and the White House Passover Seder in 2021. She blessed President Biden and Vice President Harris at the inaugural National Prayer Service in 2021, and in 2013, she blessed President Obama and Vice President Biden. She was named #1 on the Newsweek Daily Beast list of most influential rabbis in America, and has been recognized by the Forward and the Jerusalem Post as among the most influential Jews alive today. She is a member of J Street's Rabbinic and Cantorial Cabinet, of Truah's Chaverim Network, and she serves on the International Council of the New Israel Fund. A graduate of Columbia University, both undergraduate and with an MA in Human Rights, she was ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary and lives in Los Angeles with her husband and children. Evan Wolfson founded and led Freedom to Marry, the campaign that won marriage equality in the United States, and is widely considered the architect of the movement that led to nationwide victory in 2015. He now devotes his time to advising and assisting diverse movements and causes in the US and around the world, eager to adapt the model and apply the lessons that made the Freedom to Marry campaign so successful. In 2024, US News and World Report published his essay entitled What the Freedom to Marry campaign can teach Middle East peacemakers. In 2025, Wolfson was awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States, at the White House. Thank you both for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us today.
Good to
Thank
be
you,
with
Talia.
you.
So glad to be with you, and with you, Evan.
Likewise, Rabbi.
So I'm going to kick off with a few questions, and I want to start off with this one. Today is Yom Ha'atzmaut, and there is certainly so much to celebrate about Israel at 77. And even so, many of us are doing so with a heavy heart again this year, because there are still 59 hostages being held. And to echo the words of the hostage families, without them back, there is no independence. So I want to take a moment to recognize the difficult moment that we are in. And still, I'd love to start off by asking you both about the good stuff. So the good stuff meaning, when you think back over Israel's 77 years, what are you proud of? And when you look at Israeli society today, what inspires you? And Rabbi Brous, over to you first.
Well, first of all, it's really good to be together, and I'm so grateful for all the folks who are joining us in this moment. This is a really hard moment for us to know how to hold, and so doing it together feels particularly meaningful. Israel's literally on fire right now, and you know, my kids are there. My kids were both up at Har Herzl and at ceremonies for Yom HaZikaron, for Israel's Memorial Day, when the fires came, and struggled to get home safely. And from what I understand, most of the Yom Ha'atzmaut celebrations in Israel were actually canceled this year because of fire safety. So this is a particularly hard time. So we have more muted celebrations this year than ever because of the fires, because of the hostages, because of this catastrophic ongoing war. But to look at it from the vantage point of what we're proud of, I will say this. I spend a lot of time in Israel. Thank God I have family there, and I'm also part of a Hartman cohort that brings me to Israel many times a year. And I was in Israel 2 weeks after October 7th because my niece, my brother and his family live there, and my niece became bat mitzvah on October 21st. And so 2 weeks after October 7th, I flew over to be in this celebration in the midst of devastation. And it was hard and it was beautiful. And I was so struck by the incredible determination, by the sheer humanity of the people in their community in Ra'anana. After the bat mitzvah on Sunday, my brother took me to Kibbutz Shfaim, where most of the survivors of Kfar Aza had been relocated. And within 2 weeks, I saw what I think is really the best of Israeli society. Just to see the way that civil society stepped up in the face of unthinkable atrocities, opened their homes, opened their kibbutzim, took in thousands and thousands of refugees from the south and later from the north, and gave them a sense of home when their whole conception of home had been shattered. And we walked around and talked to people who were in deep and profound grief, and talked to people who were among those who were providing comfort and consolation. Then we went over to the Expo Center in Tel Aviv, and we saw what I'm sure many of the people here are familiar with, but the way that the Brothers and Sisters in Arms really transformed this protest movement, which had taken to the streets every single Saturday night for 10 months. Once the new government came in before October 7th, and transformed that protest movement into an extraordinary effort with tens of thousands of volunteers coming into the Expo Center to help place people into homes, to collect clothing and food and distribute resources. And in moments like that, I am just reminded of the incredible majesty and power and possibility of the Israeli people. I felt my heart was lifted by these incredible efforts, and I know that the people, when they have a will to try to transform reality, can do so. And so that is, for me, incredibly heartening, even as we meet this moment of so much sorrow and what seems like endless war. Just to reconnect with the will of the people is quite moving and powerful for me.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I can just echo, I wasn't there 2 weeks after, but I was there a year ago, February, so a few months after, and I was definitely struck by the same power of the people coming together. So thank you for sharing that. Evan?
Yeah, well, I want to begin where the rabbi ended, which is what has made me extremely proud is, even before October 7th, the strength and vibrancy and commitment and tenacity of the tens and tens and tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of Israelis who week after week after week after week turned out to defend their democracy, to make claims for pluralism and freedom and the values that the Hatikvah Slate stands for. And then, as the rabbi said, adapted that energy, harnessed that energy to the additional challenges that, of course, Israel faces right now. We can all find many things to criticize, and as Americans, it can start right here. We're heading into a year from now, give or take, the 250th anniversary of the United States and the sesquicentennial or whatever it is. And I think we all fear and lament many of the choices and places that our country finds itself in here. Likewise, in Israel, there are flaws, there are challenges, there are things that people need to step up to do. But the Israeli example that we just both talked about is what we as Americans also need to take up. We need to take up this work of democracy. We need to be in the streets, but not just in the streets. We need to be raising our voices. We need to be turning out the vote. We need to be mending and uplifting and reinvigorating civil society. We need to reclaim political power, and we need to defend our countries internally and externally as the needs arise in a way that is respectful and creates a better world. So I think Israel has many things to show and many things to offer, even as we deplore many of the choices, particularly the government has made, just as we deplore the choices our government is making.
I think that is so spot on, and actually feeds very nicely into my next question, which is about Israel and the US. And my question for you both is, how do you think Israeli diaspora relations have changed since October 7th? What do you think, is different? What might, we take from those changes, and where should we be looking? Where should we be focusing? Evan, happy for you to take this first this time.
Well, I think clearly the October 7th attacks and the aftermath and the war in Gaza and the dangers that Israel is both facing and in some cases inflicting have resonated deeply in America in a way that may not have been as obvious to people who hadn't really thought much about the generational changes and the information gaps and the way in which the Netanyahu era has changed the perceptions of many people of Israel, even more so than maybe for some who just coasted or relied on their innate love of Israel, as well as the history that some of us of older generations may have had. And so the politics of Israel and the need to engage the generations that are following my generation, for example, is a real big, important challenge. And clearly it has roiled American politics, not yet at the level of necessarily affecting many political outcomes, though you can debate around the edges what effect it had in the 2024 political election. But that's not even the most important part. The most important part is, how do we engage people to have a proper love of Israel and an ability to criticize Israel, while at the same in the same way that we can have a love of America and also criticize America. And I think for many of us, it wasn't apparent that we needed to be rethinking that and reorganizing around that. I think some people who are more on the front lines, like I'm sure both of you, may have been ahead of the curve on that. But for many people like me, the acuteness of this political moment and the political challenges that lie ahead as the generational momentum unfolds, and as the painful, not just optics, but elements of the choices that the Israeli government has made have their effect. We're going to have to figure out how to navigate American politics in a way that supports Israel, supports our alliance, supports the values that we as countries believe in, even if we sometimes fall short of, while at the same time accommodating people's viewpoints that are going to be different, and figuring out how to not write them off completely, and how not to allow them to have a disproportionate effect. And I will just add also that, of course, Israelis are not the only ones affected by what's happening there. There are Palestinians, there are Arabs, there are people who, whether even if not Palestinian or Arab, feel a two-sided sympathy for both peoples and want to see a better outcome for all in the region. And that affects American politics as well. So I think that the relationships have now been sharpened and awakened in a way that people may not have expected. And I just add one more little quick thing. There is exploitation of the Israeli image and relationship and support for Judaism and Jews that is happening now on the right, in the same way that there's sometimes some excesses on the left, but predominantly on the right. The exploitation of some of the tropes of support for Israel and the tropes of support for Jewish people is now also being made political. And that's going to have an effect on our politics as well, if we don't get in there and engage and find space for people to have disagreements, but also come to the core values and the core support for Israel that people like me want to have.
Thank you for all of that. I think really, really vital points. Rabbi Brous, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I'm thinking a framework that I found really helpful was something that Ezra Klein said very early in the war about it was only a couple of weeks after the war, and he shared this kind of generational analysis of what's going on with American Jews. He said that essentially my parents' generation grew up with Israel as the David in a sea of Goliaths. You know, it was this tiny state holding on for dear life, nearly overrun in 73 in the Yom Kippur War, just fighting for survival. And so that shaped a whole generation's perception of American Jews' perception of Israel. We need to support Israel, stand with Israel, otherwise it might disappear. Then there's my generation, and I'm sort of the Oslo generation. Those were the really kind of critical years for me when I was in college and and graduate school and spending a lot of time in Israel, where Israel was now very strong, but striving for peace. And then there's my kids' generation, in which Israel is very strong and not striving for peace, in which the dominant voices in the government are increasingly hardline, right-wing, ultra-nationalist, and now messianic. And so if you look at this analysis and think about what it means to be an American Jew who's in one of those generations, our attitudes and approaches are deeply influenced by the reality of the time in which we went through our Israel education. You know, really, when did we visit? What was Israel like when we first got off the plane? Was it like the rickety airport, outside of Tel Aviv, or was it Ben Gurion with the hallway with the long, descent to passport? So I think that's been really helpful and informative for us and helps us understand why so many people who are younger American Jews I think naturally incline toward Palestinian liberation, toward fighting for Palestinian dignity, freedom, and equality, and don't have a natural empathic engagement with Israeli Jews, the same way that they have a natural empathic sort of pull toward Palestinians. And I believe that this is feeding a false binary, that we can and we must see that our futures are entwined with one another. You have this kind of old Jewish institutional guard that essentially can only see Jewish suffering, that is engaged in a widespread campaign to dehumanize Palestinians. You never hear the word Palestinian unless it's followed by the word terrorist. We don't talk about Palestinian civilians in many mainstream Jewish environments. And then you have the mirror image of that on what's, the new left, which essentially dehumanizes Israeli Jews. Not their art, not their voices, not their dissent. None of it matters because anything that opposes them is a force of decolonization and thereby legitimate. And so this kind of thinking is not only overly simplistic and kind of anti-intellectual, but is also ultimately going to harm Israelis and Palestinians, because at the end of the day, nobody's going anywhere. They don't have anywhere else to go. I mean, as I said to the kids in our religious school this week, as we were doing our Yom HaZikaron, Yom Ha'atzmaut commemoration, no country in the world is like, please, Jews, come to us, we want you, and nobody's saying, hey, Palestinians, you have a home with us. So we have two people who both see this land as their home, neither of whom have anywhere else to go. These false binaries of you're either pro this or pro this make absolutely no sense. And this connects back, Talia, to what you originally asked, like what moves me most about Israeli society today. And honestly, it's the Israelis and Palestinians who are on the ground who are insisting that they have to build a future together. Think about the Bereaved Families Forum, the Israelis and Palestinians who got together on Yom HaZikaron and who did this joint memorial service. I think it's 20 years now that they've been doing it. And every year people are protesting against shared grief, because the idea of shared grief is so challenging to the false binary of either Jews grieve or Palestinians grieve. But we can't see the humanity in both. But if you actually listen to what the speakers were saying, from the depths of their anguish, from the depths of their sorrow. These are Israelis and Palestinians who are making the choice to see each other's pain and to think about, dream about, and build toward a different kind of future. And I think our responsibility as diaspora Jews is really to support those voices on the ground, to amplify, to platform, and to resource those people who are on the ground, who are actually working for a peaceful future, a just future, a safe future for everybody who calls that land their home.
Yeah, you mentioned the article that I wrote almost a year ago, I guess now, which was lessons for the Freedom to Marry from the Freedom to Marry campaign that can be applied to thinking about moving forward in the Middle East. And the rabbi's point about the false binary is one of the main themes I was really trying to get at in that piece, which is that there's just too much one-sidedness on both sides. And it's not only wrong, morally wrong, geographically wrong, intellectually wrong, humanistically wrong, but it's a mistake. That kind of thinking makes both sides less successful, less likely to succeed for the reasons the rabbi just said. Nobody's going anywhere. Both exist. Both have claims. There are rights and wrongs on both sides. And if we don't work together to figure out a pathway forward, while of course providing for security and hopefully prosperity and the future, then neither side wins. So one-sidedness is not to anybody's advantage. And I think, again, those are the values that, at least in my view, that the Hatikvah Slate is putting forward here. It's saying we need to figure out a way to absolutely defend democracy, pluralism, freedom, and security for Israel. But the only way to do that is to figure out also how to deal correctly and respectfully with others, including Palestinians, many of whom, of course, are in Israel or under Israel's control right now.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And for anybody who is not following the chat, we just stuck a link to Evan's article in there, so you can definitely check it out. So
and the funny thing is, I would like to say that the article had been overtaken by events because, of course, there have been a lot of events, but I actually don't think it really has in its core, because the core elements for how to move forward have not yet been embraced by some of the key players, again, on both sides. And yet there's still the opportunity to do so. And that's the hope, Hatikvah, that we have to have.
Yeah,
and act on.
Absolutely. So I want to dive into the sort of middle ground between the two binaries. We see a phenomenon happening a lot where there are folks, American Jews or others in this country, who may have points of criticism about the Israeli government or actions of the Israeli government. Many of the organizations sponsoring this webinar raise those concerns a lot. And those criticisms are often considered commonplace, if barely newsworthy, in Israel. But the American Jewish community has a lot more sensitivity around some of those questions or some of those concerns being raised. And I'm wondering if you can tell us what you think, to what you attribute that hypersensitivity, and how can we best navigate that terrain? Rabbi Brous, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll bring us back to this paradigm that Ezra offered. I really understand why a post-Holocaust generation of diaspora Jews who saw a profoundly vulnerable Israel was hypersensitive to criticism of Israel and felt like Israel's flawed, but it is absolutely and utterly essential. And we need to firewall any criticism that comes to the state of Israel in order to protect our brothers, sisters, cousins who live there, most of whom are refugees from either Europe or Arab lands after the Shoah and after the establishment of the state in 1948. The problem is that mindset continued to be the prevailing mindset of the established Jewish community for long after it outlived its utility. And so there is, in my space, in the rabbinic space, something that one of my friends and colleagues, Rabbi Scott Perlow, coined the term many years ago, the death by Israel sermon, which is just the treacherous nature of being a rabbi with deep roots and deep connection and deep love for Israel, but saying out loud basic criticisms of occupation, of an increasingly hardline government, of a culture that is moving toward intolerance and racism. If we say out loud the things that we clearly see before our eyes, we are called traitors. And many of us lose our jobs, lose our donors, lose our friends. And so what's happened is the establishment has held on to a script to the detriment of the Jewish people and the state of Israel. And what you see in Israel, in contrast, Talia, you allude to this, is really a much more robust conversation. I don't want to be facile about this, but I mean, I was just at Hostage Square last Saturday night at the end of Pesach, and with thousands of Israelis and the things that they were saying about their government. If those things were said from a pulpit in the United States, or God forbid, by the head of a federation or by the head of an American Jewish organization, that person would be out of a job, right? But instead, there's a much more robust discourse. The hostage families now have been saying for the last 18 months, this in no uncertain terms, that the number one priority of Israel's government must be to get these hostages home alive. There are 59 hostages still there. There are up to 24 of them still alive. Why are they not home? And yet in America, you can put up signs of hostages all over our day schools and our, federations and our synagogues. But if you speak about prioritizing the return of the hostages over total victory, yachad lenatseach, together we're going to win, you're considered a traitor. So this whole discourse is a warped discourse, and we have to change it. The only way to change it is to speak differently, to speak from a place of moral clarity, of compassion, and of love. And I don't like that I have to put my Israel credentials forward every time I speak about Israel, but I understand it because people need to know that I understand the fragility, the vulnerability, and the history that made Israel what it is today. But it's precisely because I understand all of that I speak with the greatest urgency about what needs to happen now in order for Israel to actually have a future. And I think that we need to see more communication and conversation and discourse like that in the American Jewish community.
Yeah, speaking with clarity about what will make Israel stronger, make Israel more secure, more true to its own moral and democratic values is not inappropriate. It's the right thing to do. It's what the founders of Israel did. It's what Israel at its best has done. And at the same time, we can do so, as the rabbi just said, without veering into one-sided rhetoric on the other side, without embracing the kinds of calumnies and incorrect analogies, et cetera, that unfortunately on both sides, people get spiraled into or pushed into and become more extreme in their rhetoric and their positions than they ought to be. You should be able to criticize without, at the same time, not also talking about the values and talking about also the failings on both sides and the choices that others have made and most importantly, the pathway forward. Leading the Freedom to Marry campaign, we were fighting our government, we were fighting injustice, we were fighting oppression, we were fighting discrimination, and it would have been very easy to lapse into a rhetoric of victimhood or of resentment or of claims that the United States isn't what it claims to be and isn't a democracy, doesn't have these values. Those values are not for us. This is not our document. This is not our place. We're outsiders. We're strangers in the land, et cetera. And many people at many points would succumb understandably to some of those pressures and those resentments and those grievances and those disappointments. To me, though, the most effective way of bringing a critical mass forward in order to achieve a transformation of hearts and minds as well as the law and to bring our country up to its values was to claim those values, to celebrate the good, to not throw out the baby with the bathwater in order to make the case. That, of course, didn't mean we didn't criticize. We criticized. We were in court. We were pushing politicians. I was fighting with our allies as well as with those who were not yet with us. but finding a way to do so that didn't throw them away, that didn't close them off, and that didn't give the other side the benefit of having all the values that I myself believed our country stood for, even if it was not living up to. The same thing is true for Israel. There are mistakes being made. The Israeli government, this particular government, is catastrophic for Israel, in the same way that our government in the United States is catastrophic for our country. But that doesn't mean we throw out America. It doesn't mean we throw out the United States. It doesn't mean we cede to Trump and the others the voice of what our country ought to be. It's our voice. It's we the people. And the same way with Israel, we lift up and celebrate what Israel should be for, should stand for, and in many respects is, while at the same time noting the flaws and, most importantly, pointing for the pathway forward to get Israel back on track in the same way that we have to do our own country.
Can I just jump in for a moment to respond to that? I think one of the most powerful and evocative images of the last 2.5 years has been the Israeli flag at the pro-democracy protests and at the hostage protests. And it's such a powerful statement that the people who started and ran those anti-government, anti-judicial overhaul, pro-democracy protests decided that we're not going to create a new symbol. We're going to use the symbol because this is actually the expression of the founders of the state. The version of Israel that we're fighting for is the authentic original version. The messianists are the ones who are trying to take Israel in a direction that would be unrecognizable to the founders of the state. And just seeing a flood of people crying out against the anti-democratic measures, and now against eternal war and the total diminishing of the humanity of the hostages is incredibly powerful. And there's this awkward the moment where the people who are protesting against the protesters, the counter protesters in Israel, had to find some other symbol, because the symbol of the state, the flag, was already owned by the pro-democracy side. So you started to see these symbols of the Kahanists and symbols of other kind of messianic symbols, but the flag was owned, at least for the first many months of this, by the pro-democracy and even the pro-peace camp, and that strikes me as very powerful and significant.
Agreed.
Absolutely. Yeah, couldn't agree more. So I want to ask a two-part question. The first part of which dives into the criticisms, we've been sort of talking about, which is, I'd love to hear just sort of laid out what concerns you about Israel's future if the government continues along this current trajectory. And then at the same time, how do we hold that love for Israel? How do we continue holding that love for Israel when we see the government taking actions like what we're seeing in Gaza, or like the pro-democracy protests or protesting against, that we just find so troubling? So where's the concern, and how do we still continue to hold the love? And I'm happy for either of you to start off with this.
I'm really worried that we are very close to the edge of the abyss here, both in Israel and in the United States. I think that Jews throughout history have survived and thrived in democratic environments, and in autocratic and authoritarian environments, our safety is always in jeopardy. And I am deeply worried about the trend lines in both of these places that I care so deeply about. I spoke on the Yom Kippur just before October 7th, obviously not knowing what would come, but I shared the story that there is a wonderful young mother in our community who was having abdominal pain for many months, but she's a mother of 4 and works full time and super busy and never could really pay attention to it until finally one of her friends said, "You have to go see a specialist. You must go." And she went into the doctor, and the doctor took a look at her and said, "You're going to the emergency room right now." And what they found was that she had a cancer wrapped around her spine. And that cancer might not even be related to the abdominal pain that she experienced. But because she went into the doctor and they did an honest examination, they were able to remove the cancer, and thank God she's thriving. And what I said in the sermon on Yom Kippur is that Israel as a nation has a cancer wrapped around its spine right now. And that is the cancer of Jewish supremacy. It is manifesting in occupation. It is now manifesting in endless war. It manifests in the language that people use, where they call Palestinians monsters and animals. The dehumanization of Palestinians, the dehumanization of Israeli Jews who don't share the perspective of the hardliners, the Kahanists that attacked on the Bereaved Family Forum Yom HaZikaron commemoration the other day. They were attacking a synagogue in Ra'anana, in the leafy suburbs, a Reform synagogue, Jews attacking Jews. The rabbi of that synagogue said, "We were scared for our lives." And people are now using the language of pogrom. What we're seeing right now is the normalization of a kind of extremism that really threatens to destroy the fabric of Israeli society, not to mention what's happening here and the ways that extremism is also threatening American democracy, and the ways that, in particular, Jewish extremism is threatening Jewish communal life here. But that's a whole different conversation. So I am very concerned that we are heading toward catastrophic outcomes, but we still have time. And the way to address this right now is to immediately join our voices in support of the people who are on the ground, who are fighting for peace, for democracy, for dignity, for equality, who have a dream of a different kind of future. And I think that's the most essential thing that American Jews can do right now. And this is part of the reason why I'm such a strong advocate for the Hatikvah Slate, because it feels absolutely essential and urgent. We are not yet over the edge of the abyss, but we're very, very close. And there are people in the Israeli government whose voices were 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, so fringe that they were not allowed anywhere near the main stage. And they are now running the most important posts in the government. So the fringe has moved into the mainstream. That means that the clock is really ticking here. And if we hear the voices of the hostage parents in our heads, they keep saying to us, we are out of time. Every moment matters right now. And so I believe this is not the time for us to just figure out delicately how to address. We have to come in full force saying democracy matters, peace matters. What is your vision for shared society? How can we uplift the voices of Israelis who are actually fighting for a dignified future for everybody? And that is the most important work that we as American Jews can be doing.
Yeah, one of the points I make in that lessons piece that you just posted the link to is don't wallow in the problem, focus on the pathway. We do need to be informed. We need to do the diagnosis. We need to know where the cancer is, to use the rabbi's metaphor. We need to point it out. We need to call it out. But we don't need to stew in it. We don't need to let it paralyze us. We don't need to doom spiral ourselves into misery, despair, or checking out, or whatever. We need to take action. And there are many ways to take action. One of them, of course, is voting in this election and getting involved. Another one is to join an organization and be part of a team and like-minded others who will boost your morale and sustain you, as well as amplify your efforts. For those who aren't joiners, go to a cause or an organization you care about, look on their to-do list or their website of action steps and so on, and do them on your own. Pick the ones that are comfortable for you, but spend more time doing than stewing. And that's true for this challenge in Israel, just as it is, again, true for this challenge we have in the United States. I agree with the threat that the description of the threat that the rabbi is elevating. And I also see, though, too many people wanting to spend all their time talking about the threat, talking about how terrible it is, talking about how Trump is awful, ticking off all the outrages. The same point about extremists who used to be on the fringe, now in the government, we could be saying here. But shame on us if we're giving up on our country here in the United States, and shame on us if we give up on doing our part to support those on the ground for what can be preserved and reinvigorated and strengthened and uplifted in Israel. There's plenty of action that can be taken. The clock is ticking, but it hasn't told, and it doesn't need to toll. History tells us that we can change things, that we can take a very dark moment and turn it into the foundation of a much brighter future. I mean, that's true from my own experience in my corner of the work. And I think it's true from our history, not only of the United States, but of Israel. So I do agree that we need to understand the threats and call them out and criticize, as we discussed in the previous questions. But I really think people should spend more of their time finding their ways to bring their piece to the work. And the great thing about that is not only are you doing something that helps, even if it's, in your view, a drop in the bucket, but it is also having the effect of, first of all, showing you and making you feel better and showing you can do more and leading to the next step and the next step. But it also is sending that message to others and being together, working together, whether it's on a slate, whether it's in an election, whether it's in an organization, whether it's in an effort to get out the vote, whether it's in all the kinds of work that need to happen here in this country and in Israel. We all have tremendous opportunity to make a difference. And that's what led me to join this slate. Unlike Rabbi Brous, unlike you, Talia, this is not really my world. I mean, I'm certainly aware of it. I support it. I cherish it. I love it. It's part of my history. I remember growing up and hearing stories from my mom of how when she was a 17-year-old, she accompanied her mother, my grandmother, on a transatlantic ocean liner across the sea, navigating the Mediterranean, touching in Pompeii and other places on the way to Israel, because my grandmother was a delegate to the World Zionist Congress, the first one to be held in the state of Israel back in 1951. And as a kid, that thrilled me. But I haven't spent the last 50 years working on this. The reason I'm on this slate is because I have to challenge myself, just as I'm challenging everyone and inviting everyone to take action, to do your part. If there's something you can do, be part of it. And that's how we're going to prevent that clock that's ticking from tolling the wrong hour. That's how we're going to make democracy in Israel, as in the United States, not only preserved, but reinvigorated. And we absolutely have the power to do that.
Yeah, I'm smiling as you're talking because my great-grandfather was actually a delegate to the World Zionist Congress, pre-state in, I think, 1911 and 13, if I remember correctly. But that just, everything you said resonated. And I think it leads me to think about a quote from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who said, "Optimism and hope are not the same. Optimism is the belief that the world is changing for the better, and hope is the belief that together we can make the world better. Optimism is a passive virtue, hope an active one. It needs no courage to be an optimist, but it takes a great deal of courage to hope." And I think everything you were just talking about really calls that to mind. And the work that we are doing is the work of building that hope. And Hatikvah means the hope, and I think that is so much a part of the ethos of the slate. And so I want to, recognizing the time, ask you to close out with any last thoughts you might have. And in particular, I know you've touched on this a bit, but why did you choose to support the Hatikvah slate in the World Zionist Congress elections, and why are these elections so important? Rabbi, if you want to take it away.
Yeah, I mean, I love that quote from Rabbi Sachs, and I'll just share. I spoke on Rosh Hashanah this year, which was just a few weeks, you might remember, after Hirsch and 5 other hostages were executed in a tunnel, about what hope means and where hope comes from in these times. And the reason that I spoke about that is because I and many others whom I love and trust in this space woke up after hearing about these executions and felt a deep and painful hopelessness, and just thought, this was going to happen. We were going to get those hostages home. These families were going to be reunited with their loved ones. And in a moment of, great pain, I reached out to Yonatan Zeigen, who's Vivian Silver's son, one of Vivian Silver's 2 sons. And Yonatan, after his mother, Vivian, who was a great hero and peacemaker, who built Women Wage Peace, after she was murdered by Hamas on October 7th, Yonatan essentially devoted his life to his mother's work, to picking up the baton and carrying on, as we say. And I asked him, where do you find the hope? And Yonatan said, I don't find hope. I don't wake up feeling hopeful. I wake up and do the work. And that's where the hope is born. And so essentially, I want to argue to us that hope is not a feeling, that hope is a spiritual practice, that we have to engage in the work of building a better society. And that is where the hope comes from. So joining in a conversation like this, where we can actually be honest with each other, where we can see difference and honor difference, where we can lift up self-criticism and ways that our own Jewish community has failed and needs to reverse course, that gives me hope. Building bridges and helping support people who are building bridges between Israelis and Palestinians, that gives me hope. Engaging in conversations with Israelis with whom I disagree and hearing them and hoping that they hear me, that gives me hope. That reinforces my hope. Hope is a spiritual practice. And hope is a moral imperative. And I love that this slate is called the Hatikvah slate. I love that embodied in the platform is the idea that we are not where we need to be. And as dark as the days ahead might look, that it is on all of us to engage in the work of trying to transform our reality, because as Evan said, we still have agency. There is still something that we can do. And so we have to continue to be in this fight. And I feel very honored to be connected to those who are really in the trenches doing the work, and very, very grateful to those who are on the slate.
We're grateful to have your voice with us here today. And Evan.
Yeah, well, I agree with everything the rabbi just said, and the way you even said it, Rabbi, reminds me of one of my favorite quotes of the last several years, which was from Congressman John Lewis, one of our champions and champions of obviously of so many, who in a parallel kind of construction said, democracy is not a state, it's an act. We have to act. It's we, the people, who can make a difference. And hope is, of course, one of the key elements of change. Hope is one of the key elements needed, both having it for yourself and conveying it to others, which is another reason not to wallow in the worst and not to make things worse than they are, and not to surrender prematurely, and not to be pushed into extreme language or divisive attitudes or skepticism or negativity. But to bring it to your real question, Talia, the reason what that makes me think of is when I was going through my equivalent of Rolodex these days, the contacts I have, and emailing friends and encouraging them to vote for the Hatikvah slate and me on the slate as a delegate. Some of them responded, and many responded enthusiastically, but some of them responded saying, well, I looked at the website and I have this problem with the Jerusalem platform, or I have this, I don't know about this word or this term or whatever. And eventually I said to them, look, you obviously have to make the choice you want to make, but what is more important to you in terms of making a difference? Whether you agree with every syllable and every piece and every nuance and every aspect, or like this wording or that wording, or how $5 billion gets invested in Israel. Do you want to be having that money go to settlements in the West Bank? Or do you want them to be going to rebuilding kibbutzim and strengthening Israeli society and supporting women and gay people and Palestinians and Jews working together in Israel as a vibrant democracy? Which choice do you want? Now, people can make their choices, but my view as an activist has always been to choose strategically, to bring hope to the work, and to think about what is more likely to get to the world that I want and get that pathway, knowing that there are going to be losses and defeats and disappointments and disagreements all along the way. And so that's why I can unequivocally support this work. It's not work I'm deeply familiar with every nuance of. It's not something I'm likely to agree with everybody, even on our own slate, about. Jews don't agree all the time. Neither do gays, neither do Americans, neither do Israelis. But working together and bringing together a critical mass and doing our part, we can push down the pathway to a better outcome. And that's the opportunity we have now as we turn out the vote before May 4th to get this slate elected in high enough numbers that we can come together with others who are like-minded on different slates and have a real effect on where that $5 billion goes in Israel over the next several years.
Thank you for that, Evan. I couldn't have summed it up better myself. So I just want to reiterate as we wrap up here, the World Zionist Congress election ends this Sunday, May 4th, as Evan said. That is 3 days from now. So if you have not yet voted, this is the time. You can head to zionistelection.org and vote. And I imagine somebody will put that in the chat shortly. It's a 2-step process. So first you register, you pay a $5 fee that goes directly to the course of administering the election. And then you receive a pin either by email or by text, and that allows you to cast your vote. And please vote for Hatikvah, which is line 16. There are 22 slates in this election, so just scroll on down to line 16. If you have already voted, thank you. And please, please ask your friends, your family, 2 people, 5 people, 10 people, however many people to do the same. Take 5 minutes when this webinar ends, and before moving on to whatever you have next, just text your network or email them and urge them to vote. And lastly, as we mentioned at the beginning of this call, Hatikvah staff are about to be hosting a separate Zoom immediately after this webinar ends to assist folks with any get out the vote efforts. That link was just put in the chat. So if you need any assistance with voting or figuring out how to get out the vote, how to send things to your network, any questions at all, please join that Zoom. Thank you again to our speakers. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Evan, for all that you do to support the fight for the Israel that I know we all want to see as envisaged by its founders. And to everybody who's joined us, happy Yom Ha'atzmaut, and please vote.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's do it.